Two key points there. The first is that there is a growing realization that the construction of risk is a social, economic, political process. It's not a process which sits outside a social system. It's not natural hazards which create risk. It's people, capital assets, economic activity that is exposed to those natural hazards that construct risk. And how these different factors interact with each other is determined by socio-political processes. So unless we sort of get to the root of the problem and address this, risk is, we will be tinkering at the edges of the problem and not getting to the root of it. And the second point is that while a large part of the focus has been on risk emanating from natural hazards, when actually risk management decisions are made, various risk scenarios, various kinds of risks emanate with each other. For a community that is living in a floodplain, there is a risk of losing the livelihood if you don't have access to the river. But they're quite, and at the same time, they may be exposed to, a 1 in 20 year flood. They're quite willing to take that 1 into 20 year flood risk to be able to prevent the risk of losing their livelihood. So taking account of the whole basket of risks, especially at the community level, is going to be the key in the years to come. So these are the 2 points, the endogenous nature of risk and construction of risk and multiple dimensions of risk. I think, of course, sometimes there is this notion that working on risk management or reducing risk is something which is separate from the mainstream development processes. I think if we had more concrete analytical basis, which is beginning to emerge globally now, we could show that investment in risk management is not at odds with investment in development. In fact, good development which is informed by prospective risk is risk management in itself. So they are not divergent things. We cannot go for short-term gains which can be wiped out, within a matter of weeks. You have the example of 2011 Thai floods, great economic development in that part of Thailand, but not really taking into account the risk accumulation of capital assets, economic activity such as heavy industries producing automobiles in floodplains. And within a matter of weeks, all of that was lost, and it is a setback which is, in decades. It has real implications not just for the factories that were lost, but also for the people who found employment there. So the case has to be made that these two things are not at odds. In fact, good development process has risk management built into it. These are not two separate things. There are a number of things here. The first, why DRR hasn't got the political traction that climate change is because of the history of the whole DRR practice, which was initially, at least till 20 years ago, driven by a very technocratic approach. And hence it is often seen as an apolitical process, which it actually is not. If you really go down into how risk is constructed, it's a very sort of, there are political processes underlying it. If there is somebody, there may be somebody who's prospering at the cost of putting somebody else at risk. So the narrative has to be constructed in such a way to highlight the complex socio-political dimensions of risk as well. And then perhaps we will have more traction at the political level on disaster risk reduction issues. As far as bringing the two agendas together is concerned, I don't think we can afford to not do that, simply because disaster risk reduction, 90% of disasters globally are related to climate in one way or the other. And there is a lot of accumulated experience, both in terms of anticipating on different time scales, from seasonal to interannual time scale, sometimes even longer, as well as on weather time scales, the extreme events, and putting in place measures, both short and long term, ranging from early warning, evacuation type of things, to actually adjusting cropping systems to respond to less or more rainfall in a given season. So there's a lot of experience in making use of the best available scientific know-how and applying it for risk management at the local level. Now, climate change brings additional complexity to it because the local level manifestations of climate change are not very certain. Even so, at the starting point in many cases for doing good climate change adaptation at the local level has to build on what we have learned in disaster risk reduction arena. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel about what works and what doesn't work. We know, for example, what is the role of embankments in flood management? How far should we go on in making investments in embankment kind of things? And what can we do? What are the limitations of applying seasonal to interannual climate forecasts? What are the challenges in turning, translating scientific information into usable, actionable formats that can be used by local communities? So you have a lot of experience with climate change adaptation work needs to build on from the disaster risk reduction side. But I must emphasize that all of climate change adaptation is not just disaster risk reduction. The uncertainty element adds complexity to the whole process, where disaster risk reduction practitioners need to learn and devise new approaches. Well, it depends how we define resilience. If we define resilience as something which is not just recovering from a shock, but not just recovering stronger, recovering more robust, then it is a very, very useful notion. Especially when we talk about the uncertainties associated with emerging patterns of risks that are difficult to model. We have to begin to work on approaches that build resilience in multiple dimensions and hence begin to address risk emanating from uncertain patterns, whether they emanate from climate change or whether they are because of new global economic systems which are increasingly interconnected. So if the notion of resilience is bouncing back plus, then it's a very useful concept to advance. As regards HFA2, we have a wonderful opportunity to construct a framework which builds on the experience of having implemented the Hyogo Framework of Action 1 for the last 10 years. So, and also it coincides with the climate change discussions as well as discussions with on SDGs. I would say that preliminarily, based on the current state of knowledge and the debate, there are 4 elements that one would like to see in the new framework. Number 1, much greater emphasis on risk governance with strong accountability mechanisms. It is now well accepted that disasters are not acts of God, they are not natural, they happen because of social, economic, political processes. And those social, economic, political processes are carried out by certain agents. Within that context, it is important that the new framework begins to work towards stronger accountability mechanisms for accumulation of risk. So that's one. The second thing one would want to see in the next framework is much greater emphasis on making resources, both human, technical, and financial, available at the local level. There has been a lot of discussion at the global level, at the national level. The issue is definitely on the agenda. But at the local level, the responsibility is the highest and the resources are the lowest. I think we need to, fix that, and there has to be, whether it comes from national budgets or international sources, but there has to be more predictable mechanisms of supporting risk management at the local level. The third element I would say is much greater focus on recovery. Globally right now we have predictable financing mechanisms like Central Emergency Relief Fund for managing humanitarian operations. We also have predictable mechanisms for large-scale infrastructure reconstruction through international financial institutions. There is this whole recovery window, which is a gaping hole. We need to have a much stronger, predictable mechanisms to support recovery, because that's an opportunity to build back better, as they say, and to build resilience, not just recover, but also recover better, come out stronger from any event. And in any case, one could estimate that at any given point, at least in the developing world, a third of the communities are recovering from some or the other disaster, small, medium, or large scale. So it would be very important to sort of have some system of supporting recovery efforts, and which are always led by communities themselves. The fourth thing on HFA2 would be, very deliberate way of developing synergies with the climate change talks and the SDGs. So if we come up with this a synergistic framework which takes into account what is happening in the other global policy frameworks, I think that will be a big way forward.